safety and why safety and how I've come to understand safety as one of the most integral parts of our connection with other people, including our kids, including our partners and family members, including our colleagues, and including, most importantly, ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about the physiology of safety, because one of the things that's happened in my field of social work is, and I'm quite pleased about it, is that now that we can study the brain, we have a lot more science to support sort of this holistic, sometimes, you know, warm and fuzzy feeling field that I've been in for 30 years. Now we have science finally catching up with what a lot of us intuitively knew in the first place, which is safety is an absolute necessity for human beings to thrive. It's a necessity for the kids in our care, the kids that we provide love and support to, but it's a necessity for ourselves. And I also want to talk about my own lived experience as an adoptive parent and what the reality of safety looked like for me. And it may resonate with some of you, and what happens to us when we lose our sense of safety. And a lot of this sort of got affirmed for me over the last year and a half with COVID as a therapist, because I was working with more and more people coming into me saying, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm so stressed. I don't know why I'm depressed. Well, it's because we're in a world where we are getting or at least were getting day-to-day messages that we were not safe, right? And the body and brain has a response to that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let me start just by doing a little bit of review, a little bit of neurology review here. So I'm going to do a little demonstration that I do in every talk I give, because I think it's really important, and I'm going to go back to it around what our brain is supposed to do. What's the job? And so I'm going to do this demonstration using this as our brain, okay? So the front, back of the neck, top of the forehead, right? So if this is our brain, what we know is that this bottom brainstem way back here, that's all our involuntary stuff, right? Our heartbeat, our hunger, our circulation, when we have to go to the bathroom, when we're tired, all that kind of gets figured out at the bottom. And then up here, right in the front, is what we call our cognitive brain. And that's the brain we use to solve problems and rationalize and compare things, do cost-benefit analysis on the dime, regurgitate information that you might learn in this talk, you know, a week from now. This all comes from our cognitive brain. If we could flip up that brain, part of the brain, the amygdala is really sort of back here in the center. And what we've known about the amygdala for a very long time is that it is the distress center of the brain, that it is the part of the brain that attaches to the brainstem that keeps us safe, that responds when we are in danger. Most of you will be familiar with the phrase, it's the fight, flight, freeze section of our brain, right? One of the things that we've come to understand about fight, flight, freeze is that we were leaving a category out. We all know what fight looks like. We all have kids that either are fighters, right? Sometimes fleers, like I'm out of here, I'm leaving. Or sometimes in significant cases, gone, you know, frozen. But the kids in my work that were often missed were the kids that fell under the category of submit. Fight, flight, freeze, submit. And the reason that kids in submit get missed is because they're doing all the right things. And the reason that we as grown-ups often miss our own stress level is because we are often in submit. I'll just keep doing what I'm supposed to do. I'll just stay on the radar, but low. I'll just, you know, put it on automatic pilot. But what we now know is when that's in response to danger, it's equally as stressful, equally as adrenaline loaded, and equally hard on the body as fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so this sort of came up to me when I was early in my work, when I was working with kids in foster care and at sibling groups. I would meet sibling groups, and they would often fall into these categories, right? The child that was referred to mental health, children's mental health, was the fighter, because he's creating, or she is creating, a huge disturbance in the home that he or she is in. Flight or freeze, also concerning, children that are non-responsive, or children that are running away, or children that are just not coming, into the group with other family members. But the kids that were never referred were kids that foster parents would often describe to me as such a good kid, like a little dad, or like an older brother, or like a little mother. The child that learned to toe the line, to do what people expect them to do. But what research has shown is that some of those kids that were in what we now call submit mode later in life have more significant problems than my son, who was, beside externalizing behavior in the dictionary, there's a little picture of Andrew, like he was the fighter. Like it was impossible not to know when Andrew was in distress. It was impossible because the early stages, our life was like a war zone when he was in distress, right? And I want to start too, I always have to put this in. I was telling Andrea and Vicky earlier, I always ask Andrew's permission to share stories about our adoption journey together. And he always says yes. But tonight I said to him, I want you to know it's not really about you, bud. It's about me and like some of my failures, some of my problems. And he said, I don't think you screwed up that much. I was like, well, thank you. So it was nice to hear that my impression of myself as an adoptive parent may actually be more negative than he thinks. So, but we'll get to that later. So let's go back to this fight, flight, freeze brain real quick. So this is the part of the brain that keeps us alive as a species, right? This is the part of the brain, I use the same analogy over and over again. If I'm on a trail north of London and I see a bear, this is the part of my brain that I need to kick in, and it kicks in instantly without me asking it to, right? Am I going to fight the bear? I'm incredibly weak. Am I going to flee? I'm not a runner. Am I going to freeze? Not bad. Am I going to submit? Actually, in a bear sighting, that's okay. Stand still, put your hands over your head, hope for the best, right? Just lay low and hope he doesn't notice you. So this is the part since the beginning of humanity that has kept us alive and thriving and surviving, right? Interestingly enough, now we can take pictures of the brain when we're alive, when we're working. And in brain scans, what we found, which is really important to know for the kids that we have in our lives, when they take a picture of the brain and they enact this amygdala, they trigger this distress response, it lights up like a Christmas tree. The part that doesn't light up is this cognitive part. We can't actually access our cognitive brain when our distress brain is enacted. And that's on purpose, albeit very, very annoying and frustrating at best. But let's go back to my bear analogy. I happen to love bears, which is why I use bears in the analogy. I know a lot about bears. If I see a bear on the trail and I want to use my cognitive brain, here's what happens. I think, oh, a bear, weird. Geographically, bears shouldn't be this south of Ontario. Could be a black bear. That's not too bad because they don't eat meat, but grizzly bears eat meat. They're slower. Well, actually, they're faster, but they can't climb trees. But now I'm dead because my cognitive brain has sifted through all this information that does not help me survive, right? And so when you think about the kids in our care, the kids that we are parenting, they have spent prolonged periods in their fight, flight, freeze brain, right? Submit brain. They have spent prolonged periods of time in their distressed brain. And so that has become extremely familiar to their brain and to the rest of their body, right? Now, not only have they spent a lot of time in that brain, but that brain has served them well to help them survive, right? When we have that fight, flight, freeze brain as our default, really, it comes on automatically. This is also new information we figured out about the amygdala, the fight, flight, freeze, submit brain. It's very much like a smoke detector. So even in 2021, soon to be 2022, we don't have a smoke detector that can differentiate between whether your house is on fire or whether you burnt toast. It goes off the same. The amygdala is exactly like that. Once the amygdala stresses something that is familiar to trauma, it goes off no different than if it's a 4-alarm fire, even though it might be burnt toast. And so one of the things you guys have ultimate experience with, and I experienced this with Andrew too, people will always ask me, I just want to figure out my child's triggers. I just want to figure out what triggers my child. It's an impossible question to answer. What triggers a child is danger, but we can't decide what their brain reads as danger and what it doesn't. Because once it reads it as danger, there's no talking about it, right? Because they can't access this cognitive brain. So that's sort of a review, and I'm going to come back to that neurology as we go. But as I was talking to Vicki and she was telling me some of the other trainings you've done and the experience you guys have, we're not going to talk about how your kids are functioning other than in reference. But what I really want to talk about is what happens to us when we are parenting and we go into our fight, flight, freeze, submit brain, right? So before we go on, I want to give you an example. Safety is affected by what goes on around us, right? So what happens externally in our world, that's threatening or dangerous. But safety also is what goes on in our own heads, what we say about what's going on around us. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who's a marathon runner. I've already mentioned I don't run. My son says to me, Mom, you don't run from the house to the car in the pouring rain. That's how bad of a runner. Like, I don't run. So my friend who's a marathon runner is a mystery to me, right? But here's the thing. Runners feel pain, cramping, muscle aches, spasms, nausea, high blood pressure, shaking hands, and their story in their brain is, I'm killing it. I'm doing it. This is what marathon running feels like. When they get to the end of the race and they're throwing up on the side of the winner's circle there, they're like, yeah, that's because I gave it my all. So the story they tell themselves about all those factors that revolve around pain, which 9 times out of 10, pain is a signal to our body that we're in danger. Not if you're a marathon runner. Because the story you tell yourself is, this means I'm working hard and I'm achieving my goal, as do most athletes address pain that way, right? So it's a really good example of how the external things cause us to feel unsafe, but sometimes the external things can happen and we can adjust what we are telling ourselves about those external things to make ourselves feel safe. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. Here's the other piece, back to this cognitive brain piece. Safety is essential before we can tap into any other skills, hopes, desires, wants, knowledge, or strategies, because that's all up here. It's all up here. So let me tell you, we can go on to the next slide. Thanks, Andrea. Well, let me tell you a little bit about why I feel so privileged to do this talk. I decided to adopt, how many years ago? 9 years ago, as a single person. I never really wanted to have kids, but my mom, who I was very close with, passed away the year previous. And that's sort of, and I'd worked with lots of kids who had been adopted or were in foster care looking for adoptive homes, and was very impressed and inspired by them. And then when my mom passed away, I thought, yeah, you know what? I want to be a mother. Like, that was really what, never wanted to have a baby. I'm a trauma specialist. I'm an attachment specialist. I'm an early years expert. And I want to adopt a child between the ages of like 3 and 10 or something. I don't know what my age range was, right? So can you imagine, before I ever met my son, where my story might have been about how equipped I was going to feel, about how skilled I would be, about how much knowledge I had, right? It was already, my expectations of what this situation would be like and how I would be were already up here before I even met Andrew, right? But here's the problem. We can't access knowledge and strategy and skill and perspective and, theoretical frameworks when we're not safe. So here's what I want you to think about this statement, because I'm going to return to this statement over the course of this talk tonight. I was talking to a friend of mine, colleague, who worked for CS. We were talking about, the context of this conversation was, we were talking about how toddlers often look delayed when they're in their biological homes, and then they're apprehended, and then they do better developmentally. And I said, yeah, I'm always curious about that because sometimes the moms, biological moms that I'm working with, even though they lose custody, they weren't particularly bad moms, but they were in unsafe situations. And she said, well, yeah, because that's how toddlers learn. Babies learn through curiosity. We don't have the luxury of curiosity when we're not safe. And I thought to myself, that's a lovely phrase. She's an eloquent person. And I really thought about that. And I thought, yeah, when we are with kids, when you have a toddler in a tantrum, they don't have the luxury of being curious about what you want to teach them, or what it means to be polite and use your manners, or what it means to make good choices. They're stuck in this fight, flight, freeze, submit brain, and we have to wait for them to get grounded or comforted in that part of their brain and have this cognitive piece come back online, right? Let's think about it from a couple standpoint. If my partner comes to me and says, you know, I really don't like the way you do this, I'm going to go right in here, right? I'm going to go right to my defensive brain, not deep in, but on the edge. Do you think when a couple relationship starts off with a conversation, I don't like the way you do that, that we have the luxury of being curious about what they mean? Not often. Usually what we do, or maybe I'll just speak for myself, is I come back with, really? Well, I don't really like it when you do, right? And then you're in it, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. I saw Will Smith, the actor, in an interview talking about communication skills he's learned from therapy because he had quite a traumatic childhood. And he said one of the things he learned is that when your partner tells you that something you do hurts them, your job is not to wait until you get to tell them how they hurt you. That's not actually communication. That's an argument, right? But the problem we have with family and with our intimate relationships is that we don't set up structured, safe conversations. And then when we get pushed into that amygdala, we come out with guns blazing, or we shut off, also very, very popular coping mechanism in relationships. And then the person gets defensive on the other side. And so nobody's curious about, what do you mean that made you feel that way? Tell me more about that. That wasn't my intention, right? These are the kind of conversations we work on with couples, but we have to establish safety first, right? So I've really been thinking about this idea of curiosity. And what I mean by curiosity is perspective taking, wondering, being compassionate, problem solving. We can't do any of that when we are in our fight, flight, freeze brain. Okay, so here's a couple things, a couple ingredients. What tells our brain? And I want you to think about, as you became parents to these children, or are becoming parents, or will be parents to children, through adoption, foster, kin, or otherwise, I want you to think about this list for a minute. What tells our brain that we're safe? Connection versus isolation. How isolated does a foster parent or an adoptive parent or a kin parent feel from the rest of the parents in our midst? A friend of mine used to call them civilian parents versus in the trenches parents, right? One of the things that I recognized right away when Andrew came to our home was that I didn't want to tell people how he was reacting and behaving, because I knew that my civilian friends, parents, typical, with typical kids, whatever that means, would start a lot of their sentences off with, you know what you need to do? And every time a parent said to me a sentence that started with, you know what you need to do, I will guarantee you it will not work on my son. That is not a strategy that followed that was useful or effective or supportive, right? The other thing that tells our brain that we're safe is predictability. When we have predictability, we know what to expect. When we know what to expect, we feel competent. Taking a child into your care who has struggled or who has had a trauma history or an attachment disruption means that you are signing up for unpredictability. And when things are unpredictable, Our brain reads it as a threat. If I'm in a forest I've never been before, and somebody says to me, sometimes there's bears, sometimes there's coyotes, sometimes there's nothing, I'm going to be pretty on edge, right? If I'm walking through Thames Park by the river in London here, and somebody says, oh, you know, we've never seen a coyote there in 10 years, then I'm going to feel differently about that walk, right? Predictability is one of the things that the brain latches on to establish safety. It's one of the reasons why when kids come into our homes in foster care or adoption, we want to get those routines in place right away, right? We want to get their primary needs met right away so that at least they can start to have a prediction of what might come. But the child's needs and lived experience and their own trauma take that predictability and throw it right out the window, right? Competence versus helplessness. When we feel competent, we feel safe, we feel equipped. I don't want to pick on CAS, but I will. And I will admit that perhaps in some cases, we are not always told all the details about the children that are coming in our home. We do not have all the information that would be helpful to feel prepared and equipped to meet their needs. One of the things that shocked me with my son, because his behavior came out in such aggression at the beginning. He was 6 years old when he came to us. And when I was talking to his CS worker in another city, she said, oh yeah, I was hoping he would have worked through that by now. And I was like, you never thought telling me that he was like totally, self-abusive and injurious and destructive and potentially could hurt people and himself would be helpful information to have for me to feel equipped, right? Competence is extremely important. Helplessness means we're at risk. There's nothing we can do, right? Which leads to optimism versus hopelessness. And when you're exhausted, and when you don't feel equipped, and when you have a child who is showing you with every ounce of their blood, sweat, and tears that they are terrified, it is very hard day after day to feel optimistic about what that child's going to be able to do, feel, achieve, succeed, etc. Right? Optimism is essential for safety. So are options. Options versus feeling trapped. So many parents have said to me that they felt completely alone, that they didn't know who to ask for help from, and that they didn't feel like they had any options. If you don't have any options, then you don't have any autonomy. You don't have any self-control over what's happening to you. And as a human, if we don't have self-control, we are at the mercy of someone else, which means we feel unsafe, right? Knowledge versus confusion. So all the training that you guys are doing, all the modules you're watching, all of that information allows you to start having more theories, hypotheses, questions, curiosity about what's really going on, instead of looking at a child's behavior and thinking, I don't know why they're doing this, right? What we're learning about trauma and attachment is so important because it's giving parents the whys of why the child is doing this, right? And then stillness versus fight, flight, freeze, submit. It's very hard when you're a parent of a child with high needs to be still. It's very hard because even I know when Andrew would go to bed at night, and he was a good sleeper. I'm just saying it was a good thing. He was a very good sleeper. But when he would go to bed at night, if I would hear him an hour later, even rustle, I would be in my fight, flight, freeze, submit brain. I need to refresh. I need to reboot. I need to get myself back together. If he wakes up, I am doomed, right? I am at risk. I was in my fight, flight, freeze, submit brain, and I didn't even know it, right? So this is really important because the danger that our brain senses comes from being alone, from not knowing what to do, from seeing the worst, and from, which isn't on my list here, but from personalizing. So here's what I mean by personalizing. When I feel like I have to be the answer to my child's pain, and he is reacting to me in a way that's frightening or physically threatening, aggressive, destructive. Oftentimes what parents will do, including myself, and sometimes they say it out loud, and I may have been that parent as well. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you talking to me this way? And as soon as we put the to me, we have to go into our protective brain. We have to go to that edge of fight, flight, freeze, submit, because now we're saying, I'm at risk. You're doing this to me. As opposed to, my son's 15 now. Sometimes when he has an angsty moment, he's come a long, long way, but sometimes when he has an angsty kind of moment or he swears or whatever, now my narrative in my head is like the marathon runner, that's just 15. There it is, 15, right? That means what I'm seeing is not an attack on me. It's just happening. And that in itself, that shift in itself can help us steer away from that fight, flight, freeze brain. Because if it's just 15, then it means it happens to lots of parents who have 15-year-olds. And if it happens to lots of parents who have 15-year-olds, it's not about what I'm doing wrong. It's not about what I haven't taught him, what I haven't, showed him. It's not about disrespect. It's about a need that he has that I need to be curious about. But it's also what happens when you're 15. You're kind of supposed to be angsty with your parents. You're kind of supposed to challenge them, right? And then on top of course, his lived experience. Okay, so here's a slide. You can skip that slide, Andrea. Here's some pictures of me, and I only put those up there not because I want you guys to have lots of pictures of me, but I want to just talk about this because this has to do with identity. And I'm going to tell you a quick story. Maybe you guys have heard of this person or not, but there's an attachment specialist, very gifted, very well researched, very well written. He has a book called Hold On to Your Kids. I highly recommend it. His name's Gordon Neufeld. Gordon Neufeld studies attachment and trauma and survival and relationships. He did a workshop here in London that was privately funded by a group of parents who adopted internationally. So lovely people. We're talking about parents, though, who have resources and who put their resources into adopting children from a foreign country. Great. The reason I went to the workshop was because the topic was on interracial relationships and adoption, and my son is part Jamaican and part Chippewa. So we asked if we could come, even though he was from CAS and not from another country, and they said yes. So these are pretty privileged people. There was only about 30 of us in the room, maybe not even 25. And this is how Gordon Neufeld started this talk. And I warn you, he's a bit arrogant, but he's earned his cred, so I'll give him some space. He says, so you've all adopted children, and we're all like nodding. We're all happy that we're there and gonna get some support and knowledge. And he says this, there's only two reasons that people adopt. One, you couldn't have a baby of your own and you think this kid will replace it. Or two, you think you're a hero and you're going to rescue someone. Neither one's going to happen. And you could just see like everybody in the room was like, oh, how could you say that? And then I sat back and I thought, use my language, I thought, shit, I'm a rescuer. I've always been a rescuer. I was a rescuer when I was 4 years old. And so then you have to think about, what does the identity for me of a rescuer mean to my experience as a parent? And so the questions that I was asking myself as I was preparing to adopt, who am I? Who was I? These pictures of me in this slide are me before Andrew. I am an aunt. That's my niece in the picture with me. I'm a business owner. That's my office that I renovated. I'm a traveler. I'm an adventurer. I'm a dreamer, right? I'm a creator of my own life. That's how I saw myself. And then this little boy came in my life. So let me tell you a little bit about what the first 6 weeks of adoption was about. And before I do that, let me also tell you that when you take on the role of parenting a child that you did not give birth to, people think very highly of you, typically. When you take on the role of parenting a child that you did not give birth to, and you're a social worker and an attachment specialist and a trauma specialist, I could not have had more kind things be said to me than in the preparation to adopt Andrew and after Andrew came. And the more, and particularly after Andrew came, the more people said, he's so lucky to have you, the more shame I felt because I was not able to respond to him in a way that was curious or in a way that was compassionate at the beginning. So this is actually a story of Andrew's adoption, but in other words, it's really a story of what happened to me because what happened to me when Andrew came to me was just as life-changing as what happened for him. And in other words, it's what he taught me. So he came into us and I had a partner at the time, but he wasn't living with me. So I was a single applicant. Andrew came to live with me when he was 6.5. And within the first 6, the transition was quick. You know, he left his foster home. He had 2 overnight visits with me and then he moved in, basically over a 4-week stint. The second he moved in, we had like a week of like everybody thinking he was the cutest. He really is attractive, but I know everybody says that about their kids, but he's the cutest kid ever, right? And then his trauma kicked in. And by week 5, I was in the ER with a broken nose. He had accidentally, sort of in a rage, backed his head up against me and split my nose open. And again, I'm not picking on CAS. However, I will say that this happened at 6:10 at night. And I had my partner come home from work to be with Andrew, who was now traumatized again, because once I started bleeding, the rage was gone and the guilt and shame were there. And I went to the ER with a friend of mine and I called after hours CAS and the worker said to me, is Andrew at risk? Do you think your partner's going to hurt him? And I said, no, but it's chaos. Like he just broke my face. I'm waiting for stitches. He's at home. He's like, could you say, well, as long as he's not at risk of harm, you can call your worker in the morning. And that was the first moment that I felt really, really unsafe with my son. That was the next day actually, that I said to my partner, I don't know if I can do this. And then the spiral in my brain, because now I'm in my fight, flight, freeze, submit brain. And I don't have the luxury of being curious about my own abilities. All I'm seeing is now people are going to know that I've been injured by my son. People know I'm a professional in this community. What if I can't do this? How am I ever going to work with families again? I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to have nothing. Andrew should have been adopted by someone else. I never should have wanted to be a mother. What? What I've discovered by working with so many kin and foster and adoptive parents and by being with myself, adoption breakdown, which we all learn about when we take our training, adoption breakdown doesn't happen because of the child's behavior. It happens because of how that behavior makes us feel about ourselves. When I've worked with parents where adoption breakdown has occurred, they're gutted, but they always say things to me like, I couldn't take another moment. Not I couldn't take another moment of the child. I couldn't take what I was telling myself about the moment. Why is he doing this to me? Why is he doing this to my other children? Right? So feeling safe as a parent and as an individual is the only way that we are able to tap into our compassion. Because if I'm in the forest and see a bear, I can love bears all I want. But compassion is not the way to go. When the bear is coming at you, you're not going to say, but wait, I love bears. Doesn't matter at that point, right? And so it didn't matter what my intentions were or my story was, right? Interestingly enough, my partner, who I then married, he had a different view. And he said to me one day, I was having it out with him in a discussion, debate, argument. Why was it so much harder for me parenting Andrew than it was for him? And he said, well, this was your idea. Like you came up with this before I came along. He said, when I met you, he said, I kind of thought this is going to suck. And he said, my expectations were here and the reality was here. So it's pretty good. He also came from a home where there was a lot of violence, and the expectation was anything better than that was great. I came from a very high functioning family who told me you can rescue anyone and you can love is enough. And if you want it bad enough, you can have it. And my expectation was here and the reality was here, right? So the more unsafe I felt, the more unable I was to control my own emotions. And it wasn't until I started talking, and I had to pick the people that I talked to very carefully, because I knew that some of my friends and some of my family, I didn't even tell my dad that Andrew broke my nose, my nose got broken. I didn't even tell him. I just didn't see my dad for like 6 weeks. It was like, oh, sorry, still busy, Dad, because I had like stitches across my face, because I knew my 82-year-old father would say, that's enough. You don't have to do this, right? Other parents, friends of mine who were parents, I didn't tell, because they would say, well, I would never allow that to happen. In what way would you not allow that to happen? Right? Like their ideas of what parenting and control and respect and authority is doesn't work for kids with trauma, right? And so the first person I told was not an adoptive parent, but she worked for CAS as a foster and adoption support worker. And so she knew very well that my challenges were not isolated, that I was not alone, that I was not incompetent, that I was in my fight, flight, freeze brain and not able to grab the skills and the curiosity and the perspective taking that I needed to parent Andrew. So what do you do? What do you do when you've lost your safety? Well, I'll tell you. Connect. You connect, you connect, you connect. And first, well, it doesn't always have to be in this order, but it usually works this way because we're worse at connecting with ourselves than we are with other people. When you find your crew, I like to use that word, your like-minded people, you know, you tell your story to another parent who's a kin or a foster, and they're like they give you like a little nod, right? Like, oh, I so get this, right? Then you're able to have an honest conversation. And as soon as you say it out loud to someone else, you're not alone in it. And once you're not alone, your sense of safety increases. So you don't have to be in that fight, flight, freeze, submit part of your brain every time your child has a reaction or every time you give them a limit, right? I still have trauma when I give Andrew limits now, and he's beautiful. He accepts my limits like nobody's business, and he's 15. But sometimes when I think, I don't want to tell him he has to come home early, because I'm still back at when he was 7 and he could escalate and be explosive and things could get broken and et cetera, et cetera. My work was not just connecting with my peer support, but also doing my own therapy and figuring out my own story, my own identity, what I thought about who I was, what my job was. I had to shift from fixing to being with, right? I had to change from teaching to comforting, which in my family growing up was not a thing. Actually, comforting was not a thing. Teaching and ambition and excellence was a thing, right? And so I had to rewrite my own story of who I wanted to be, but I couldn't write that story by myself. The other thing that I had to really engage in is what I call mattering moments. I had to figure out ways every day to remind myself, and sometimes I couldn't, and I relied on my peers to do so, to remind myself that I mattered too. Because when you have a child with really intensive traumatic attachment needs, they matter. They're little. Even my own husband would say, Dana, you're the grown-up. He's the kid. Like, get your shit together. But if I didn't feel like I mattered, then I couldn't feel safe. And I couldn't get to what I needed to be with him and let him know that everything he was feeling and doing was a sign of what he needed, not what he was doing to me. Does that make sense? And so connection to yourself and connection to peers is very similar, because what you're doing is you're telling your brain that someone has your back. And if someone has your back, even if it's yourself, that means you're not alone. And if you're not alone, you're safer, right? Our bodies and brains are always trying to move towards safety. Everything the kids do that we love and care for, no matter how difficult those behaviors can be, are attempts at safety. Even if that safety is predictability. Andrew used to say to me when shortly after he was in a rage or had a rage, he would say, "Mom, I'm going to be so bad, you're going to remember you don't want me." Because that's predictability for these kids. And in the early stages, Andrew would have chosen that predictability over trusting me for years. I had to earn it. He didn't owe it to me because I had a beautiful home and I had a nice room for him and I loved him and I, went to therapy for him and all those other things, right? That's not on him, that's on me. And so when I think about you guys and the role that you have in these kids' lives, I don't want you to forget about you. I want you to prioritize you so that you can establish safety in your communities, in your families, in your peer groups, and in yourself so that you can get out of that very slippery edge of your defensive brain. Because when we get angry with our kids, disappointed with our kids, punitive with our kids, sometimes threatening with our kids, name calling with our kids, I'm not saying I've done these, I'm just saying it's out there. But when we do those things, we do that out of fear, not because that's what we think of them, but because that's where we're pushed in the moment, right? But the same goes for them. When their behaviors are coming up, their behaviors are coming out of fear too. And so before we can help establish their safety, we need to establish our own, right? And there's all sorts of ways to do that. And I've told Vicki I can supply you guys with some good resources. Mindfulness is a good way to do that. Self-compassion practices, whatever they may be, are absolutely essential. 2-minute time periods a day of just doing something, having a glass of water, washing your hands, listening to a song, writing something down, texting a friend, 2 minutes at a time. The brain can react to things that we do for 2 minutes when we do them repetitively and routinely because it's predictable. And we have come into situations with kids who need us to feel solid. And we need to be able to enjoy and be curious about the potential of these relationships, but we can't explore that potential unless we feel safe and solid within ourselves. So I really encourage you, I know Vicki's going to talk a little bit about the peer support piece, and I think it's really, really essential because unless you've lived it and viewed it and watched it and felt it, other parents, typically, there are exceptions for sure, but other parents who have not had those struggles will not know how to support you and make you feel safe. And so you are doing this job that you have chosen and that we all are privileged to do, but it's tough, it's complicated, it's confusing. But if we can come back to ourselves and say, today I'm showing up and that's the best I got, then that lets us feel safe in that role and more equipped to do better the next day and the next day and the next day.